I had just learned how to speak, when I swore to make women fall madly for me in this life. But unexpectedly, the first person to be captivated by my looks was actually my mother. One day my father was teaching me how to wield a wooden stick and fight. My mother saw us and immediately scolded both of us. She thought I was still a baby who couldn't even walk. It was way too early for me to be learning how to fight. My mother would often take me to the market on Ashburn Street. I loved the magical items there, and could see dazzling displays of magic. Because my father and I shared the same bad habits, my mother thought I would grow up to be an adventurer. But I often sneaked away to the study. This was the place where I honed my knowledge every night. The reason it was so backward was because the people here only valued magic. A mage's first awakening occurs between the ages of 3 and 20. So I began trying to imitate the movements in the books. To my surprise, during my first attempt, I sensed the fragments of the device inside me gathering. I am truly a genius. Just then, a pair of big hands picked me up. "Little rascal," said, "this is where you are." I pretended to look innocent, hoping to ease my mother's concerns. She even thought I couldn't do my business. I quickly let out a fart to prove it. Then my face turned red. Damn it, I got so focused on sensing the magic just now, that I ended up wetting myself. As time went by, every time I snuck off to the study it became a problem for my mother. She even considered moving my crib into the study. But then she thought, maybe I'll wait until he's older. After all, I couldn't even walk yet. How could I possibly understand books? 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Every day my father would practice martial arts in the yard. Although he was strong, he always showed off in front of me. It was so embarrassing. Next, it seemed like he was going to cast some incredible magic. He pushed his hands forward, mumbling incantations under his breath, and stood there frozen. I held my breath and focused. Meanwhile, the stones beside him began to move slightly. Then he shouted loudly, and suddenly raised his hands above his head. The stones were lifted into the air by magic. With another roar, he slammed his hands forward. The stones all fell, moving forward by a centimeter. This was the worst magic I had ever seen. It was even weaker than a fart. And my father was still proudly asking me to praise him. After finishing, he said, I turned to get off the chair. But ever since I came to this world, I had somehow developed a fear of heights. In my past life I rode horses and fought battles. But now I was afraid of heights. This inner fear made me cautious. I bent down to try to reach the ground. My mother saw my frightened eyes and thought I was just sleepy. She immediately picked me up and walked toward the bedroom. As we passed the study, I muttered a few words in simple Mandarin. Mother though coaxed me, telling me to go to sleep. I had no choice but to play my trump card. I pushed my mother's shoulder with my little hands, opened my eyes wide and begged, Mom. Yeah, Mom. At that moment my mother couldn't resist my 24K beauty. She held me struggling internally for a moment, and finally said all right just one time. I secretly rejoiced inside. Indeed, this method always worked. Seeing how much I liked reading, my mother felt very proud. Most 3-year-olds just like to play. But here I was searching for books. I must be a good son. Just then, a loud crash was heard outside. My mother told me to stay calm and go help. Taking this opportunity, I immediately sat cross-legged. I began my cultivation. Over the past 2.5 years, I had gathered tens of thousands of magic fragments in my chest. It should be successful any moment now. It should succeed any moment now. Now I just need to gather the last fragment of the magic core to complete it. Meanwhile, my mother went outside and discovered that it was my father showing off, and he had accidentally knocked down a tree. Just as my mother promised not to abuse him, an unexpected explosion occurred with a loud bang. The violent explosion roared like a wild beast. The shockwave from the blast was terrifying. Fortunately, my father shielded my mother with his own body. They were unharmed. After the explosion subsided, they finally realized what had happened. At that moment my mother's eyes were filled with regret and worry. Yeah, he's still inside. When my father heard this, his face turned ashen. He leapt to his feet and ran toward the blazing ruins. He pushed the collapsed stones aside, but upon seeing the scene inside, he took a step back in shock. The next second his legs gave out, and he knelt to the ground. A wild, unrestrained laugh escaped his lips. It was unbelievable. A 3-year-old child had actually awakened a magic core. I woke up from my meditation. The sensation of generating a magic core was so wonderful. From within the house I could clearly see the trees outside. But when I saw the chaos around me, I flew into a rage. Who the hell destroyed my mansion like this? It took me a moment to realize. Although the house was blown up, I was still 10 years ahead of other children. And now I had become the model child in the neighborhood. Another year quickly passed. In this past year, my mother taught me to read and write. My father was in charge of my physical training. Just a few days ago, he finally allowed me to officially begin my cultivation. On my 4th birthday, my father, to encourage me, personally carved a wooden sword as a gift. And since then, every day he would teach me swordsmanship. but as the former commander of 5 million troops in my past life, I had already mastered these basics. So in order to gain more meditation practice, I gathered all my strength into the sword. I spotted an opening in my father's defense. Suddenly I launched an attack on him. There was a crack. The wooden stick in my father's hand snapped. My wooden sword, however, was sent flying by the recoil. My father was quite surprised by this. My son definitely inherited my amazing memory. I bade farewell to my father and went back to my room to meditate. Just when I was finally deep into meditation, my mother called me to dinner. "Can't you let me study in peace?" Helpless, I had to turn my anger into appetite, devouring the food in front of me. Just as I was enjoying my meal, my father said to my mother, "I want to find a teacher for him." My father believed that his teaching was wasting my potential, but my mother didn't want me to be too far from home. So all the pressure was placed on me. My father asked me, "Do you want to go to the big city and study with a professional teacher?" I secretly thought, my father is really something. Letting a 4-year-old decide such a big thing? It seemed unreasonable, so I made a suggestion. "How about we all go together to meet the teacher?" As soon as I said that, they both fell silent. I went silent too. Did I say something wrong? But the next second, they both burst out laughing. How come we didn't think of this idea? My father slammed the table. "Well then, we'll leave tomorrow." So the next morning, we set off on our journey. 5 of my father's former comrades in arms joined us on this trip. One of them immediately suspected I wasn't my father's biological child, because I was polite and cute. One of them taking advantage of my guard being down. One of them suddenly picked me up from behind. He hugged me tightly in his arms, so much that I nearly suffocated. A tall figure like a bear, with a gentle temperament like a dog. Another one was very cold to me, only nodding his head before going into the carriage. The last one was an archer. I politely shook his hand with my little hand. After securing the cargo, we boarded the carriage and set off. This was my first time witnessing how vast the world is. The sunset on the horizon was particularly beautiful, but as night fell, things started to become dangerous. However, everyone in our group was very strong, and they took care of all the security for me. In the deep mountains and forests, the campfire was something I had never experienced before. It made me feel somewhat unadapted. Seeing that I lacked energy, the archer sister next to me started chatting with me. She said that my father always praised me as a genius. The red-haired Trancy, overhearing this, suggested that we train together. It would be a good way to stretch before bed. I secretly thought, "Can't you stretch on your own? Why do you have to drag me into this?" Just as I was about to refuse, she picked me up in one swift motion. She carried me and ran toward the open space. "Are you ready, little one? Do you know how to reinforce your weapon?" I stretched out my muscles and looked at her. She had already taken up an offensive stance. The next second, a figure like a fierce tiger appeared behind her. It growled. I looked pitifully at my father and mother. Is it really necessary to bully such a cute child? My silly father, however, cheered me on. "Since that's the case, I'll have to use all my strength too." I raised my sword in front of me, gathering all my energy within. I launched the first attack. I charged toward Trancy. Trancy merely chose to defend cautiously, but just as my wooden sword struck his weapon, the immense recoil from the impact forced me to step back a few paces. Damn, this body is still too weak. I can't unleash my true strength at all. I once again concentrated my magical power into the sword. The wooden sword in my hand emitted a dazzling white light. I swung it fiercely toward him. Then I crouched to dodge his sweeping horizontal attack. I timed it perfectly and pushed off the ground, using my body to charge at him. I followed up by swinging the wooden sword again. At that moment, his whip-like kick arrived. I relied on my body's flexibility and defied logic by bending backwards to dodge the attack. The moment I avoided it, he also stood up. The next second, the long staff and my wooden sword clashed violently. According to Newton's third law of motion, we were both sent flying backwards. I landed heavily on the ground. My mother was so worried that she almost scolded me. My father rushed over to check my injuries. He questioned me about where I learned these techniques. Trancy was the most surprised. How could such combat skills appear in a 4-year-old child? Even my father didn't realize how well he had taught me. I had to make up a lie. I said I learned it from books. Looks like I'll have to wait until I'm older to show my true strength. The next few days, the journey went smoothly for everyone. The entire trip was very pleasant. But I noticed that something was wrong with my mother. When I asked her, she just brushed it off. I had no choice but to give up. I continued reading my book. But just then, the carriage suddenly started shaking violently. The archer sister Helena shouted, "Robbers! Prepare for battle." My mother instinctively pulled me into her arms. At the same time, dozens of arrows shot toward the carriage. Fortunately, Angela immediately cast wind magic. She protected the carriage. My mother held me tightly as we looked outside. In an instant, the mountaintop was filled with bandits. Clearly they had been lying in wait for us. At this moment, a man with sausage-like lips stepped out from the crowd. He wielded a massive axe weighing at least 1,000 pounds. His face was lewd, and his voice was somewhat effeminate. "This is quite a good haul, brothers. Let's not harm the women and children. After all, damaged goods will lose value." For a moment I was so relaxed that I failed to notice the danger was all around us. I gripped the wooden sword at my waist, seriously scanning the surroundings. My mother saw my expression and hurriedly pulled me into her embrace. "Don't be afraid, I'm here," she said. In her arms, I slowly calmed down, but the battle outside the carriage was dire. There were simply too many enemy archers. In the chaos, arrows flew straight toward me and my mother. In a critical moment, Angela suddenly appeared and saved us. Meanwhile, my father revealed his true strength for the first time in front of me. He charged alone into the enemy's formation. In an instant 3 enemies fell to the ground, but in the end 2 fists are no match for 4 hands. And with enemy reinforcements arriving in waves, the bandit leader pressed forward. He walked toward us wielding the massive axe. I urgently urged my mother to treat my father. My mother, tears streaming down her face, hesitated. My father, however, told her not to use healing magic. He insisted he was fine. Then he looked at me seriously and said, "Listen carefully, I'm going to stop that bandit with the axe. You and your mother need to run. Don't stop for anything." I pounded my chest and said to my father, "How could I leave you behind? Where was the 4th? I can fight too." My father smiled reassuringly. His broad hand gently patted my head, saying, "This may be the last thing I say to you, Aisley. Listen carefully. Your father knows you're strong. That's why I entrusted your mother to you for protection. But don't ever let me down. Protect your mother and the sister growing in her belly." At that moment, details from the journey flashed through my mind. It turned out my mother was pregnant. The nausea I had noticed earlier was because of this, but I hadn't realized it. I swore to my father, "I will protect mother and the baby." At this point, the bandit leader ordered to capture my mother. I grabbed my mother's hand and ran with all my might. "We will see father again alive. I believe in you." At that moment, a bandit holding an axe in his left hand and a knife in his right charged toward us. He lunged at us, blocking our path. From afar, an archer drew his bow. He aimed at me and my mother. In the next second, I heard the sharp sound of the bowstring snapping. The sound was getting closer. My hair stood on end. I immediately turned around, waving my only wooden sword in front of my mother. I poured all my magical energy into the sword to block the arrow. Luckily, the wooden sword broke, but it deflected the arrow's path. The bandit who had just released the arrow was stunned for a moment. In the next second, I struck him in the head. "Yasi, don't stop." I kept running with my mother, carefully scanning the surroundings. Initially, there had been 4 spellcasters on the enemy side, but now only 3 were still fighting. At that moment, the bandit leader suddenly shouted, "The plan has changed. Kill them all. Leave no one alive." I was confused, wondering who he was speaking to. I looked up and saw a spellcaster on the cliff above us. Gathering magical energy, huge magical orbs began flying toward us. It was an enormous threat. I could use magic to dodge, but my mother couldn't. I swore to protect her. I couldn't disappoint father. It was a critical moment. The plan must not allow me to overthink. I used all my strength to push mother out of the danger zone. "I'm sorry, mother. You may get hurt a little. Even if I can't survive, I'll make sure to take down a spellcaster with me." The magical orbs instantly enveloped me. I was thrown toward the cliff. At the same time, I threw a dagger with all my might. In the next moment, the dagger connected to the magic thread, wrapped tightly around the spellcaster's knee. The combined force of the magical orb and my pull dragged him toward the edge of the cliff. He grabbed hold of the cliff edge with his bare hands. We both fell together toward the endless abyss. At that moment, I felt strangely calm. I truly hoped everyone would be safe. My life has indeed been short. The only regret is that I never got to see my sister's face. But I don't know how much time passed. The sharp pain all over my body forced me to open my eyes again. I was still alive. The bandit I fell with had lost all human form. The sight made me feel nauseous. It took me quite some time to recover. At this moment, I was thirsty and hungry, but I noticed food and water not far from me. Using the last of my strength, I forced myself to sit up. I crawled painfully toward the food. Even though the fruit was bitter and astringent, at least there was a water pouch nearby. I didn't know whose it was, but thank you. After eating and drinking, I started to feel drowsy. When I woke up again, the pain was still wearing down my will. I tried to get up, but I collapsed to the ground. So I adjusted my breathing, channeling my magic to my heart. Then when my body wasn't paying attention, I strained and forced myself to stand up. I grabbed my small pack. I retrieved the dagger from the bandit's body. I didn't know how long I had been there. My parents must be worried. I cautiously looked around for an exit. Just then I heard a gentle but authoritative voice near my ear. "Dad, you're awake." I immediately became alert and hid behind a tree. Could it be a trap? I trembled as I grabbed a wooden stick. and poked the bandit. Seeing that he didn't move, I silently let out a sigh of relief. Then I heard the voice again. Don't worry, the body won't speak. I drew my dagger, and asked the voice, who are you? Did you save me? But all I saw in the jungle was a small rabbit, which hurriedly ran away when I startled it. Yet the voice spoke again. It's me, I'm the only one who can help you get home. I didn't believe the voice. But at that moment, I desperately wanted to know how my parents were doing. And I wanted to see my sister. I couldn't bear the thought of them crying over me. So after weighing the pros and cons, I cleared my throat twice. I asked, Mister, can you tell me how to find you? The person laughed heartily. You're quite clever, but I'm not a mister. I'm the most beautiful person here. I thought to myself, this guy's shamelessness is thicker than my father's. But how did he know my name? Suddenly a terrifying magical aura entered my eyes. The energy quickly filled my body. My vision began to blur. But then I clearly saw a cave. The voice said, this is the place. I suggest you set off now. So I once again set off on my journey to find the beautiful person. I had many questions I wanted to ask her in person. Just then I heard the sound of flowing water. If I'm not mistaken, there must be a stream ahead. I happily jumped into the water like a 3-year-old child. After a refreshing splash, I began to wash my dirty clothes. But then, the beautiful person's voice echoed in my ear again. The little guy seems pretty happy. Freedom must feel wonderful, right? I quickly protected my little brother. But the voice mocked me as a little brat. There's nothing to see. Sis has seen it before. I quickly put on my clothes. I comforted myself, reminding myself that I once was a king. Stay calm and composed. Just wait. When I grow up, I'll make you my concubine. I continued my journey, hurrying to find my parents. My mother is pregnant. What if she thinks I'm dead? That would make her sad. And it wouldn't be good for my unborn sister. As night approached, I finally arrived at the place the beautiful person had mentioned. All I saw was a large mountain. I politely greeted the mountain. I thought to myself, this beauty is too big. If size matters, you'd definitely be #1 in the world. But she told me she was in a crack beside it. I walked toward the cave emitting an eerie glow. I instinctively swallowed. Mom, Dad, I'm almost home. But as I took a step forward, the stone beneath me crumbled. And there was a deep hole straight down. I fell quickly down the hole. I instinctively protected my handsome face. Unfortunately, my face still hit the ground first. What bad luck. I'll have to rely on my face to make a living later. I slowly got up. I looked around to assess the situation. But as soon as I saw what was in the corner, I was so scared that I fell backward. I sat down hard on the ground. This isn't a beautiful person at all. It was a black stone statue with only its features glowing red. I actually thought it was her. Looks like my plans for a concubine are cancelled. The statue slowly spoke. Little one, we've finally met. It walked toward me with heavy steps. I opened my mouth in fear. I thought to myself, this guy is 100 times more terrifying than my mom. He extended his claws, slowly reaching for me. I'm doomed. I actually believed his lies. I delivered myself to him. Who am I supposed to complain to? But what I had imagined didn't happen. He extended his hand towards me in a very friendly manner. He said he would build a time tunnel. It would take some time to send me home. He offered me wild fruit to gain energy. I thanked him. I walked over to the wild fruit. The fruit was as big as a watermelon. The surface of the fruit was unusually smooth. The smooth surface reflected my handsome face. I remembered the happy times with my parents. The endless longing made tears well up in my eyes. But just then, the statue behind me suddenly opened its mouth. I jumped in surprise, but it only wanted to remind me that there was something better. Looks like I'm still not used to being around it. The time tunnel wasn't finished yet. I sat beside it. I ate the wild fruit and chatted with it. I learned that its name was Shijibia, and it was actually a girl. This place was the Beast Forest area of Elsha Forest, and she had been here alone. She had blocked all those who tried to approach. Her chest wound was from her final battle with an enemy. Because of the things she possessed, many enemies sought her out. I was the first human to come here. The reason she saved me, maybe, it was because she was moved by my courage and determination. Or perhaps it was simply because of her loneliness. After Shijibia walked away sadly, I seemed to understand why she felt so lonely. Then she turned back. She gently said, I almost forgot to tell you. Although I can't accurately pinpoint your parents' location, I know your family and friends are safe. Hearing these long-awaited words, I felt deeply comforted in my heart. I'm so glad they're all safe. Thank you, Shijibia. The days that followed, I got along very well with Shijibia. During the times when she wasn't building the time tunnel, we would sit together and chat. Day after day, we grew closer and closer. From her, I fully understood the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. Although her appearance was scary, she had a warm heart. She would gently hand me freshly picked wild fruit, and her kind demeanor reminded me of my mother. Sometimes I would also remember those who had done wrong, and a surge of hatred would rise within me. One day I vowed to make them suffer and die. But Shijibia didn't agree with my thinking. She believed that wrapping my heart in hatred and resentment would only make me more miserable. She taught me to look forward and live my life with dignity. She was more like a teacher to me, always speaking to me about philosophy. Afterwards she would comfort me with guilt. Though she had an evil-looking appearance, she had a deep understanding of morality and life. She not only changed my view of life, but she also taught me mobile meditation. This technique revolutionized the clumsy seated meditation method. Even during battle, I could absorb magic power steadily. But just as Shijibia was about to finish the time tunnel, her old injury flared up again. She collapsed exhausted. She had been enduring intense pain while building the tunnel, helping me return home, and this cost her life. Seeing Shijibia lying in a pool of blood weakly breathing, I felt deep guilt. She had helped me unconditionally, and the cost was the draining of her life. But Shijibia said, "Actually you helped me escape the cave. You were always curious about my name. You'll find it doesn't match my appearance." With that she shed her stone statue disguise. Soon a pair of pure white wings broke free from the shell, followed by feathers glowing with a holy light, accompanied by dazzling golden radiance. His true form revealed itself. It turned out this was Shijibia's real appearance. I never imagined he was actually a divine beast, a flying dragon. Once Shijibia shed his disguise, it meant his position was now exposed to the enemy. But now we didn't have any time to lose. We had to finish the last stage of the time tunnel before the enemy arrived. Not long after, the tunnel emitted a brilliant red light. He entrusted me with a dragon egg that glowed with the same light as the tunnel. At the same time, he shed some of his feathers and told me that using them would conceal the dragon egg's aura. I was just about to ask him why, but he suddenly collided his head against my body. Immediately after, he sealed all his magic power into my body.